Good afternoon, good evening, welcome, and many thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which aside from me includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome and many thanks to Jon Michaels of UCLA Law. It's a special treat to have Jon with us because both me and the late David Lehrer, co-founder of America at a Crossroads, are proud UCLA grads, and David was very proud of that. And Zev is a Bruin as well, so an especially warm welcome to Jon. We are so pleased to have you share your wisdom and analysis with our America at a Crossroads audience. Welcome also to the amazing Madeleine Brand, one of our beloved regular moderators. We hope your Passover Seders were meaningful and soulful. This year it was particularly cogent to relate the ancient story of the Exodus and liberation to current events, and we hope that the balance of your Passover experience is enriching as well. Last week, I received many emails asking if it was true that we are reaching tens of thousands of viewers with our program, and the answer is yes. We have broadened our audience through an expanded use of social media. In fact, over the last several weeks, our programs have attracted as many as 40,000 viewers via our postings on YouTube. So we are doing our best to keep as many people as we can reach, informed, engaged, and motivated. Please share the links with your friends and give us the names and emails of anyone you'd like added to our regular email list. As long as they consent, we are very happy to have more members to our list. Next week, we'll welcome former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, and global democracy scholar Larry Diamond. Both Michael and Larry are professors at Stanford University in political science. They are both senior fellows at the Hoover Institution. And next week's topic is Trump's foreign policy, the impact on global democracy and U.S. national security. And we couldn't have two more highly qualified speakers to be able to share that topic with us. So we hope you'll join us. Now, please welcome the great broadcast journalist and one of our regular America at a Crossroads moderator, Madeleine Brand. Madeline has an amazing show called Press Play on KCRW, an NPR affiliate. Madeline can delve deeply into any important issue of the day, and today she will do so with Professor Jon Michaels on the topic of the subversion of our American democracy. Madeline, the program is yours.
Thank you so much, Janice. And it's great to be back. And Jon, it's great to have you join us. Just by way of introduction, for you, Jon is a professor of law at UCLA, as Janice mentioned. By the way, I went to Berkeley, so I'm sorry, I'm not part of the UCLA mafia. And he's an expert on presidential power there, on ethics, on regulatory states, and the privatization of domestic and national security. He's a graduate of Yale Law and a former Supreme Court clerk. He serves as on the advisory board of UCLA Safeguarding Democracy Project. His first book was called Constitutional Coup. His new book, which he and his co-author David Null wrote before Trump's reelection, but it accurately describes much of what's happening now, is called Vigilante Nation: How State-Sponsored Terror Threatens Our Democracy. Here's what it looks like. All right, welcome, Jon. Nice to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I'm a bit of a salesperson too, because I have my books behind me as well. But I appreciate the opportunity and to share my thoughts, and also with the kind of changing times, we can go well beyond the scope of the book.
Yeah,
To
well,
talk
it's not
about
a
the
meme
moment.
coin, so it's all
No.
good that you're selling that. Okay, so let's talk about what the definition is of the book Vigilante Nation. Vigilante, you call it vigilante democracy. What's happening now? I think we all have an idea of what a vigilante is. Maybe a Bernie Getz type of character, someone who takes the law into their own hands for their idea of justice or retribution. But what you're arguing is something different. It's state-sponsored vigilantism. And so describe what that means. What's the definition of this?
Yeah, so we emphasize terms like vigilante democracy and even terms like legal vigilantism to be a little bit provocative, because I think most people in our understandings of the world and our familiarity retreats to ideas of what lawyers would call ultra vires, acting outside of the scope of the law, and that categorizes someone like Bernard Getz to a T. Okay, someone who doesn't like the world in which he inhabits and takes the law into his own hands, and notwithstanding the fact that there is a regime that would close down on him, as happened in that case. What we want to kind of talk about is American history's dalliance with vigilantes and more formal types of partnerships between governments and actors who are ostensibly acting on their own, but in coordination or a wink and a nod with state authorities to extend the reach of the government and carry out its policies in a more comprehensive, a more invasive way than we otherwise could. So the way we define legal vigilantism is operating with the tacit understanding that the state is either going to provide what we call ex ante, ahead of the fact, legal authority to engage in a certain type of behavior, or pretty sure that prosecutors won't prosecute for instances in which private actors exceed the legal bounds. And that could be, and if it's not the prosecutors, maybe the governor, like in the state of Texas, might pardon you after you've committed an act of violence that's against the law. So just to give an example of an ex ante law that this has happened in Oklahoma and in Florida, there are now legal defenses to ram your car into protesters if you have a fear that there could be damage to you or to your property. And so that created a kind of an opportunity ahead of the fact that if you are confronted with, and in the time in which these laws were passed were Black Lives Matter marchers. And if you feel that there might be some credible threat to you or to your property, meaning like your car could get scratched, you have license. It's an affirmative defense. So we're talking about things like that. We're talking about non-prosecution, and we're talking about ultimately pardons.
Would that also be like a stand your ground law as well?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And so in the book, we talk about that we didn't go from a world in which everyone behaves perfectly into ramming your cars into one another because you feel irked. And there's a slow but steady kind of licensing of violence. And we could talk about how the old law, the old criminal defense law, was you could resist with force in a context in which you had no means of escaping. So you're backed into a corner or you're confronted in your home, and that was actually called the castle doctrine. Like the person, a man is sovereign and king of his castle and can do things. And then we went, and many states shifted from what was called the castle doctrine to stand your ground laws. And that essentially meant wherever you are, even if you had the capacity to withdraw, you didn't have to. And so you could meet force with force, and you could meet force with arguably disproportionate force if you felt threatened, meaning you could use a gun. So we have a bunch of legal regimes that have essentially enabled greater and greater tolerance for all forms of violence. And now we have the kind of register of the kind of the political rhetoric, the tribal politics, the illiberal politics of this administration, but red state governors across the country. And we have a kind of a heady brew of danger and violence and fear that is manifesting in ways that chill all sorts of normal and legally protected rights like voting, speaking in public, marching, engagement of that sort, all of which has been chilled dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay, I want to get to that in a second, but I just want to stick with the stand your ground law because it made me wonder as you were talking. I'm sure people who are in favor of these laws and are in favor of this ramming into protesters law in Florida and in Oklahoma, these laws, that they would say that these are our individual liberties, and especially with the stand your ground law that are guaranteed by the Second Amendment, amongst others. So I'm wondering about the Second Amendment and if you think that this would fall under, I don't know, state sponsored, state protected vigilantism?
Yeah, I mean, looming heavily over almost any conversation we have about society and justice in America is guns, because it changes the very nature in which we conduct our politics, in which we conduct our domestic affairs, our social affairs, and increasingly even our economic affairs. Because the other countries could have instability of our sort, but they don't have the guns. Other countries can have people confronting one another politically, or because they don't like the way they parked in the parking lot or anything else, but we don't have the guns. So the kind of propensity for violence in our society is so much higher because of the risk of lethal force being exercised. So I think it casts a giant shadow over everything. Does the Second Amendment justify the stand your ground doctrine? I don't believe it does. Does it justify ramming cars? I don't believe it does. But does the way that our Supreme Court has interpreted the Second Amendment, is it consistent with a kind of a cultural ethos in which violence is normalized? I think the answer is a resounding yes.
So this history of legal state-sponsored vigilantism, we've had this in our
Yeah,
history in the
yeah,
past in America,
yeah,
maybe from the founding. There was a brief pause, I guess, during the middle of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, but you're saying it's back. How is it different
yeah.
now than, I guess maybe you should give us a quick little history lesson
Yeah,
of
may I do that?
what,
Yeah.
and
May I
then we'll
do that? Because, yeah,
afterward.
can we step back a little
Yeah,
bit just to
thanks.
give some perspective here? Because some of this was new to us, and we had been studying around these issues for the better part of our academic careers. And we weren't able to uh, recognize when we embarked on this project how tightly connected the current movement is to previous moments. So maybe many in the audience feels the same way. But the idea that vigilantism in America is abnormal is something of the exception as opposed to the rule. And that surprised us that there's so long of a history of documented state support of political forms of violence that the brief period that Madeline's referencing, which is essentially from the time that the Civil Rights Act was passed and rigorously enforced, is a very small moment in our history. It's
Mhm.
the high point of our American democracy from, say, 1964, 1965 until the mid 2010s. But it's if you look at it in the grand scheme, it's almost a blip on our historical chart. And so one way to recognize state support of violence takes us all the way back to the fugitive slave laws. And invariably, ways in which full social and physical and economic control over enslaved persons was ensured was tacit understandings between plantation owners and the government that they had one another's backs. And things got a little bit harder to maintain once enslaved persons were seeking to escape to the north. And then how do you may be able to maintain control in Virginia, but what happens when they get to Massachusetts or New York or Vermont or elsewhere? And so we didn't have a clear plan about what to do in this essentially ignoble compromise that's part of our Constitution about what do you do with slavery. And so we had to pass a statute. We didn't have to, but we did pass a statute that allowed individuals to go into the North and take back their quote unquote property with force if necessary. And the importance of this measure was because the northern states weren't going to do this. They certainly weren't going to expend time and resources and money chasing after someone else's property that they might have had moral objections to, besides any other number of reasons why they have competing challenges with limited resources. We didn't have large police departments at the time. So instead, we essentially empowered, we, the federal government, empowered an industry which then had a vested interest in going further and further into the north to get more and more money and to kind of blanket the landscape. And this also disempowered the northern governments, which couldn't exercise their full control over how policing and public safety is done in their town. Right. in their states. Um, and so we have this moment in which the Civil War, and we think, okay, things are going to change, and we're not going to do this anymore. But as students of history know, our period of Reconstruction was short-lived, and the backlash against it was profound. And so then we enter into a period which starts off with the so-called Black Codes and really just morphs into a sustained period of Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
And during this extended period, again, we have the government and private actors working hand in hand to subordinate the Black population. And this was particularly powerful in that moment because there were federal civil rights laws that limited the amount that the states themselves could do in terms of disenfranchisement of the vote, refusal to honor contracts that were duly entered into by Black citizens. And so the states' hands were sort of tied. And so what they did was they made a decision to look the other way while private actors filled that role. And so we have a period of time in which it doesn't really matter whether the state catches you, the sheriff catches you, or the private mob catches you, you're in trouble. As I said, that period ended largely when there was such a abhorrence of what happened with the Freedom Summer Riders, what happened with the campaigns of domestic terrorism in the South in the late 50s and the early 60s. The Civil Rights Act and credible enforcement by the Justice Department essentially wiped out that kind of private forms of violence and pushed it to the side.
Mm-hmm.
And just to bring things back up, what's different now, which was the real question, is today it feels extra gratuitous and extra alarming to think about the resort to private violence and what are they getting at? What are they seeking to do with it? And that's the question about, is this about the kind of Adam Serwer's popularly quoted phrase, which he ascribes to the Trump regime, that cruelty is the point. David and I, when we talk about our project, we actually say cruelty is not the point. It's actually a means to a greater end. And the end is the subversion of democracy. And the way to do that is by brutalizing and scaring people to leave, to conceal who they are, or to accept a subordinate role in society.
So what you're saying is that this is race-based, that a lot of this is based on the original sin of slavery in the United States. A lot of this vigilantism, state-sponsored vigilantism, is in direct relation to the fact that white people owned Black people in this country. And that has gone on to influence this idea of the state condoning individual violence up and through to the modern age, to right now. What is the example? What examples do you see now of how that is being carried out?
Yeah, I want to broaden the question a little bit. So I'll give you the specific. But one other thing that's different about it is it's no longer just a black-white issue. It's a male-women issue. It's straights versus
And
LGBT
immigrants.
persons. It's right. It's the right type of citizens versus the others. So the agenda has become so big and so expansive and so vitriolic, in part because it's responding to the broader civil rights movement of the post-1965 era, when we have not just, Black equality or striving towards Black equality, but we have gender equality. And then more recently, we have the expansion and pretty swift recognition of LGBT equality in a time period that was quite truncated compared to the other movements that took decades, if not centuries, to move forward. So one thing that's different today is it's not just concentrated on race.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually thought, maybe a little naively, when we started out with the project, like, oh, it's going to burn itself out because it's 30% of the public going after 70% of the public. It's not sustainable. It seems to be sustainable. We could talk about that in a second. But I do want to answer your specific question about where does race factor in here particularly. And I'll give you a couple of examples of it. One is the kind of most concrete version, and I would focus here on kind of a paradigm case, but he's really representative of a larger group of actors. It's Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Okay, Kyle Rittenhouse lived in the state of Illinois, um, and he heard from other right-wing white supremacist networks that there was going to be a resistance movement against the Black Lives Matter marchers going through Kenosha. And there was essentially a call to arms to protect property, which is often the justification, again, going back to slavery property.
Mhm.
And he got in a car, he picked up a gun, and went there to essentially protect the neighborhood. And while he was there, because we've been able to kind of retrace the steps through a very widely publicized trial, he had cordial interactions with police. They shared water bottles. They discussed their plans. And then he felt threatened and, engaged in a campaign of multiple shootings that resulted in two people dying in his acquittal, notwithstanding that evidence. Again, there's a number of people who did kind of Rittenhouse-like things in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in Austin, Texas, in Georgia, that are other examples of where either there was a non-prosecution or a ready defense on the ready legal defense on the grounds of self-defense. Another bucket, so that's the most kinetic form of political violence, is gunplay or gun violence. Another bucket is election deterrence, suppression, and neutralization. And here we have examples of individuals and groups well armed, almost invariably well armed, showing up at town hall meetings, county supervisor meetings, political rallies, state legislative assemblies in the instance of the state of Michigan, showing up and kind of making their voices heard with guns as opposed to persuasive sloganeering or anything else. That was the way they were registering their concerns. All of that has had a kind of incalculable effect on political engagement, political discourse. How many people who would have showed up didn't show up because they knew the guys with the guns were going to be there? Or how many people who were going to bring their kids to watch a civic engagement in action are going to be like, you know what, let's leave the kids home. Let's break that kind of intergenerational educational opportunity because it just doesn't feel safe. Or how many people, cover who they are, mask what they're saying, censor what they otherwise might want to contribute to the public discourse, because now there's guys with guns hanging around, making menacing looks, following people home from these events, doxing speakers, all of which has created kind of a culture of fear and chilling that has led to the systematic harassment of election workers, which we know was prominent in Atlanta and in the state of Arizona. The state senator, the president of the state Senate, his house was bombarded with a kind of cavalcade of cars driving around his house all night long, even though he was a rock-ribbed conservative Republican. And he also, and it was well known because it was, it's a small place, his adult daughter was dying from cancer at the
This is
time.
Rusty Bowers you're talking
This
about?
is Rusty Bowers. And and then there's a whole what are they doing at schools and what are they doing about censorship thing, but I think I've talked too long.
Right. And of course, Rusty Bowers testified in the January 6th inquiry,
Mhm.
correct? Or was it?
As did the women in Fulton County, which is Atlanta, Georgia. It was a mother-daughter who were being harassed
Mhm.
by Rudy Giuliani and his team of surrogates who were tormenting the family, and the family had to go into hiding.
Well, so that brings up January 6th
Yeah.
as the kind of the big kahuna, I guess, if you will, of this kind of vigilante behavior. At the time, not state sponsored, but in retrospect, ex post facto, with the people who are convicted and sentenced to prison, then their sentences commuted by
Yeah.
President Trump. And most of the Republican leadership and party now saying the 2020 election was stolen. So is this an example of what you're talking about? And what do you think that that is going to mean for political vigilantism going forward?
I have to say that a lot of the measures that David and I have studied came about after January 6th, in part because the states were under the impression that what happened on January 6th wouldn't fly ever again, that there would be a crackdown, as there was, and that the political culture would say that's a bridge too far. And so they tried more nuanced tactical approaches because the kind of grand flourish of a storming the Capitol and threatening the vice president and the Speaker of the House was not going to fly. So now we get to the point on January 20th, 2025, and we realize, oh, it's going to fly. It has flown. And in the foreseeable future, some of those folks are going to be running for office and serving in certainly positions of state government and perhaps even in federal government before too long. So what does that tell us about the world of vigilantism is twofold. One could be that there's a further merging of state and private violence. And what we're really seeing now, and I think the Trump administration's actions over the last 3.5 months support this, is that we're really going from a government by the state to a government by a party, a faction, a group of people who have different relationships to the state. And here I'm thinking about Elon Musk. There's all these different folks who are in a complicated way engrafted onto the state that makes a private, paramilitary group seem, oh, that's just kind of part of their motley crew. So I think we're going to see a more diffusion of power between public and private in general. It's going to be a messy diffusion. And I think we're going to see folks who are going to expect that their governors or presidents are going to have their backs. And so we're going to see more brazen forms of violence in the name of MAGA, in the name of whatever movement it could be. And I think we're also seeing just a coarsening and a more desperate political culture in general, where we might see some tactics of despair manifest as political violence, as we saw with the Luigi Mangione instance. And perhaps, though, the evidence is still not fully clear about Sorry, that's the case of the young man who gunned down a CEO of a healthcare company in Midtown Manhattan. And I think most of the folks are aware of what happened to Governor Shapiro's home this weekend. And it speaks to, one, that we're in a moment of great political despair, but two, that resorting to violence is increasingly becoming part of our political diet.
However, in terms of statistics, instances of political violence, of actual violence, are not at a high point, according to experts. If you look at the 60s, the late 60s,
Yeah.
there was a lot of obvious political violence happening. But also what you're talking about is a vigilantism that is legislative and political, not necessarily at the tip of a gun or a
Yeah.
knife or whatever violent object, a car, but in terms of denying people rights. And one example would be this Texas law SB 8, which
Yeah.
deputizes people to turn in healthcare providers for providing women with abortions. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, I can't remember, everything's a blur. The depart uh, the health department, HHS, issued a statement that people who could do the same thing nationwide with healthcare providers for gender affirming care for
Yeah.
trans people. So, can you talk a little bit about that, about this kind of vigilantism that's not necessarily carried out at the tip of the
Yeah.
spear?
Yeah. Just one quick point on the data on that. So that you're 100% right on the data. What's a little different now is the virility of every single action. So the kind of compounding effects of one person doing something and the chilling factor across the country is the magnitude is so much greater. But numerically, you're right. We are more peaceful. This country is not overridden by crime, and I didn't mean to or violent. I didn't mean to suggest it is. But the gun ownership continues to increase. Gun carrying laws continue to liberalize. And so the propensity for violence is just below the surface, as it were. Um, I'm glad you mentioned SB 8 because in some ways, so SB 8 is the law that predated, but only by a few months, the national abortion ban, sorry, the overturning of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade that guaranteed the right to reproductive autonomy for 49 years. When everyone kind of who followed the Supreme Court closely knew that Roe v. Wade's days were numbered. And so a few months beforehand, Texas passes this state law that allows individuals to privately sue doctors, nurses, even the taxi driver, the Uber driver who takes you to the clinic, potentially any employer who gives you the day off and it knowing that you're going to have an abortion because you're all facilitating what they would, the termination of an unborn an unborn life, as they would phrase it. And so you could bring challenges to this, even though you have no personal stake in the outcome. You're not a shareholder of of Uber. You're not on the board of directors of the hospital. You're just a neighbor. And you could bring a suit. And the financial damage for bringing these cases are devastating. So overnight, all the healthcare clinics in Texas shut down overnight. And that again speaks to the chilling effect. You don't actually need to have lawsuits as long as there's a credible threat to lawsuits.
Mhm.
So what's going on here? Why did Texas do this when the state could simply ban abortions as they did the minute that Roe v. Wade was overruled in a case called Dobbs? And that's the kind of challenging question. What is going on? So a couple of reasons why I think they do this, and this I think completely maps onto the gender affirming example that's much more recent. The individuals can reach much further than the government. So who did the clinics that shut down fear? Okay, they feared that a disgruntled employee was going to have over some issue that has nothing to do with the culture wars, would be like, I want to screw my employer, and so I'm going to rat them out, and they're going to suffer from that. Or a moral gadfly who finds it reprehensible that their healthcare facility supports abortion rights, and so they're going to rat them out. Or someone in the office who's upset because so and so always gets special privileges, and now they're getting a day off for making, again, speaking in the language like a bad choice, and now they get rewarded for it, right? So it's all these people, or someone looking out the window. Who's the neighbor in Bewitched? Gladys Kravitz,
Yes.
looking out the window. I'm dating myself here, but looking through the window, always seeing what the neighbors are up to, and then picking up the phone and causing a stir. Right? So what motivates that? And this actually was central into the Supreme Court case about the constitutionality of SB 8. And the question that was raised, including by Justice Thomas, was like, what is the injury here? What is the neighbor's injury here? And the Texas lawyers said the tort of outrage, that I'm just offended. And that's not really grounded in our legal understandings. Usually there has to be an economic or physical injury and not just this kind of emotional, I wish the world were different from the way it is. And even it tripped up Justice Thomas on this point. And the reason why I want to underscore it is because this is essentially elevating grievances into legal rights and opportunities to profit. So you're creating an entire industry that's kind of built up on this gotcha of being invasive. And then if you know it's not just the state that's investigating, but could be anyone around you, think about how much your behavior is going to be chilled accordingly. And the last thing I want to say on this is uh, uh, um, don't overlook, or I don't want you to overlook the point about people feeling like it's now their job to enforce the culture wars, how that's building and strengthening a right-wing political base. Because all of a sudden now they've gotten off their couch and they're not just griping about, oh, I can't believe so and so had an abortion, but now they're the lever of punishment. And how else, once they've been the lever of punishment in that context, where else are they going to take or the hammer of punishment? Where else are they going to take that hammer next? And how can this further mobilize a movement that is a real minority movement? There's not a lot of Christian nationalists out there. So you have to make them kind of foam at the mouth in order to have them have the political intensity to be a sizable force in America going forward.
They're a sizable force in red states, right? But not in the more populous blue states, New York, California.
To date, that's true.
So how
But
is it that they
yeah,
are able to carry their agenda through on a national level?
yeah. So there's a couple of ways that is being achieved. One of which is the Electoral College has a bias in favor of the red states, because of just the way we count votes. And this is historically the South has always exerted disproportionate political clout nationally because of the way in which our boundaries are configured and the way in which we send people to Congress and to vote in the electoral office. So you can be, and that's why even with this last election, the estimates were that Kamala Harris would probably have to win by 4, maybe 5% of the popular vote to carry enough electoral votes on to victory. So don't discount the South as having disproportionate weight. But your question still holds, and the specific answer to your question is twofold. One of which is that the newer forms of legislation are trying to reach blue state allies. So if I donate money to an abortion clinic or an abortion facilitating mechanism that essentially enables folks to go from Texas to Denver or Albuquerque or Los Angeles to have an abortion, am I somehow involved? And some of the lawyers some of the activist lawyers in Texas want to say yes and want to hold those folks who are allies out of the region liable. And so that's a way of, again, chilling alliances. It doesn't necessarily mean that the folks that stay within their state are vulnerable, but it means that us as a country are leaning further and further, are being further and further dragged into the kind of right-wing orbit, as it were. So I think that's the first and most important way. And then the second way is again the fact that people can travel across state boundaries. My example doesn't work well with Kyle Rittenhouse because Illinois is a blue state. But you can imagine essentially red state warriors going into blue state communities and making it more and more uncomfortable for people to express their political views. And we have seen in some blue states that there are like MAGA caravans coming in to disrupt big events and things like that. So the kind of cohesiveness of America makes it a little bit, but not at all improbable. And we could talk about this too, about what recourse can blue states have. I don't think it's at all the case that if you're in a blue state, you're just going to be overwhelmed by what's going on in Alabama or Tennessee or Texas. Quite the contrary. There's ways in which blue states can push back on that agenda.
You have a whole section at the end of the book called Model Blue State Laws, and you have 19 of them.
Yes.
And it's almost as if you're calling for a secession, in a sense, to enact these laws that would act as a bulwark against what's happening with these vigilante laws in red states. And one of them involves actually penalizing, or maybe a couple of them, but one in particular that actually penalizes red states economically. Can you explain that one?
Yeah. So I just want to say I'm not calling for secession.
Okay.
Um, and
That was my characterization.
yeah, so
Well,
and quite the opposite. I mean, I feel like the if one really wanted to kind of be more insular and be like, we're in California, it's really unfortunate for the people in Alabama, but we're in California, then they don't have to do my model suggestions at all. And that would actually be that'd be a more parochial response of the sort that secession, like we're going to take our resources and just hunker down here, as opposed to trying to be more connected with the other states and try to engage with them in a different form. So what I'm talking about is a little bit more like tough love
mhm,
than turning your back and wanting to use the kind of so blue states don't have disproportionate political power, as I said, but they do have disproportionate economic and cultural power. So how can we leverage our strength to reshape America in the same way that red states are leveraging their strength, which is disproportionate political power? We kind of want to just flip the script on red states kind of, kind of overwhelming the rest of the country and say, well, blue states actually have a lot they could be doing here too. And so the things we talk about are ways in which there's actually advantages under our current constitutional system where blue states could make it really hard for red state companies to do business here. And some of these examples that we draw from don't have anything to do per se with the kind of political violence, though they do have to do with the difference between red and blue America. And so California has, and we start this last chapter with this example, California has a kind of a humane treatment of pigs law, of pigs to slaughter law. And in order to sell pork products in the state of California, the producers have to certify that they're meeting essentially the California standards.
mhm.
And most of the producers in places like Arkansas and Texas, they have very lax regulations. So they have to make a choice, according to the Supreme Court, which allows California to have this law. And it was an initiative. So many of our listeners voted one way or another on this in the late 2010s. Um, uh, but two-thirds of the Californians supported this, and essentially means that if you're buying pork in California, um, you have raised the standards of an industry nationwide. And why can California do this? And you know, Rhode Island can't do this. California's a really big market. This may not be the biggest pork.
Right.
This may
It's
not
gonna,
be the biggest pork eating universe on this call, but the state, we have 35 million people here, and there's a lot of pork consumed. And so California is able to exercise and kind of reach out in ways that I think are, in some ways, are very politically problematic. That California gets to dictate essentially slaughterhouse policies for the nation just because we have a big economic footprint. But for lack, but that's where we are right now. We're in a world in which we have this resource, we have this tool. The kind of political philosopher in me might say, well, that's not really fair. But I think there's a lot of things going on in the world that's not that fair. So Californians might want to use the same techniques and tactics to say, hey, if you want to do business in California, well, you need to respect LGBT rights. And no matter what the state requires or doesn't require of you, you need to, you need to be on board with the kind of guaranteeing, reproductive health care for your employees, things like that. And now maybe you lose a couple of businesses that can't compete here, and maybe that means our prices go up a bit. But most folks are going to want to do business in California. And Madeline, if New York gets on board too, if we don't have to do all the rowing for the nation and New York gets involved too, and Illinois gets involved, all of a sudden it just becomes no choice. They're going to have to do it.
So you're saying the solution lies with the private sector. So
Well, not
business.
perfectly because the states are regulating the markets here. So the states, I mean, yes, it's true that we could make individual decisions to boycott products, but that's really inefficient. But the state can essentially say, if you want to do business, if you want to be on our shelves, you have to comply with these laws. And by the
Mhm.
way, the federal government has done this for years. And the federal government, way before we had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the federal government said, if you want to be a federal contractor for the United States, and most companies want to do that, and we did this during World War II. So we didn't wince during a period of time where we were desperate to have munitions and everything else. We said, hey, you guys can't be discriminatory. You guys clean up your act, you can do business with us. You don't clean up your act, you're out of luck. So it's not the market acting autonomously. It's the state through us essentially changing the rules in which you can play in our market.
Okay, let's go to some listener questions. There is a lot of concern about the Trump administration and as being an actual vigilante organization in terms of defying the rule of law when it comes to the Supreme Court, and especially with these immigrant Venezuelan and roundups and people sent to El Salvador without due process to this gulag of a prison.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, what next? It appears there was a decision today or a statement ruling issued today that it looks like the Trump administration is in contempt. It seems that he is ignoring the Supreme Court's urging that they facilitate bringing back this El Salvadoran man that they wrongly took to this gulag. What happens if the administration continues to defy the Supreme Court on this and on other issues?
Yeah. I'm glad the question was raised because it's hard to have a conversation and not talk about what's going on in this moment and how large and profound a change it's having on our society and our culture in at a pace that almost is incomprehensible. So if the courts, there's two things that are going on, I think, with the courts. The first is the courts have to make a calculation of, are their orders going to be adhered to? Are they going to be respected like they have been respected by every other national administration in the lifetimes of anyone on this call? And so if they think that they're not going to be respected or followed, then they have to make a decision whether they're going to say anything at all. And that, like, we're already in this world in which, well, why would you pull back? And the reasons you'd pull back are it would expose the frailty of our separation of power system, that the courts really don't have power unless the other constitutional actors consent to that power, which is not something we've understood as being the case, that judicial opinions are advisory only. Right? So do you want to expose that in this particular moment? Or do you want to kind of wait a little bit longer to see if Trump kind of gets too far ahead of his skis and there's more of a backlash that the courts won't be out there on their own trying to say, hey, take us seriously? Okay, and this is not a good position for the courts to be in. This is not part of the judicial training manual. This is me trying to process what motivates this. So I want to really credit Judge Boasberg for stepping up, notwithstanding the fact that he could be exposed for having no power in this moment, but two, because he's putting himself and his family in peril because there's a real strong political movement that doesn't like to be there's suggestions that Donald Trump does anything wrong. Right? So there's real fear. And it's credible, and there's already been talk among judges and among state law enforcement about how imperiled judges are right now in this moment. Okay, so that's the question right now is, all right, so I'm gonna step up, I'm gonna hope for the best, I'm gonna hope that the Supreme Court which is fairly Trumpy, is going to have my back on that. So again, not a given. And then what can we do now that if Trump just says, no, too bad. Actually, he's out of our hands, and we don't want to have a diplomatic issue about asking for him back and this and that. And the El Salvadorian government doesn't want to give him back because who knows what he's going to say about his time in
Mhm.
El Salvador, and doesn't want to alienate Donald Trump either. So we're in this kind of morass, and I think I just want to underscore, it's really not at this point. If we're at this type of stalemate, the courts aren't going to be able to save us. We're going to need to do something else, and something else I'm not exactly sure what it would be. But then we have to think more about like how do we make ourselves more resilient from the federal government? Do we hunker down in our states? Do we say like the universities are making decisions right now? How can we live or can we live without federal funding? How much can the states kind of make themselves less reliant on the federal government and therefore risk losing federal funds if they declare their state a sanctuary state? So it doesn't help the man who's been rendered to El Salvador, but maybe we can limit the ease with which they can be the next round can be um, uh, 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 basically secreted out of the nation. And the question that Harvard and Columbia and maybe in a couple of weeks UCLA is going to be grappling with is, can we live without federal funding? There may be a time where states have to have that conversation among their leaders and with their public.
Are you hearing that conversation at UCLA? Are
Oh,
you?
no one talks to me about anything of consequence at UCLA. Um, but it is a conversation that I would expect should be happening, um, because the universities have to figure out like this is a catastrophic loss in federal funding. Are we able to withstand that? What projects will be eliminated? How much, advancements in the sciences that require momentum? If those researchers might go somewhere else in the interim while we're waiting to kind of get back up to speed with our funding. So I don't have any, I'm not playing coy. I really don't have any understanding, but my advice to anyone in any capacity would be think about how you can become more resilient when the federal government is using funds as a weapon.
Not to get too much darker than we already have, but isn't that actually the bigger point on the part of a lot of these architects of this, thinking of the Project 2025
Mhm.
writers and someone like Christopher Rufo, and that is to starve the universities of funding anyway.
Yes.
So wouldn't that just play into their hands to not take the money?
Um, in the
I guess in
short
Columbia,
term, yes.
but
So in the short term, yes. The question, these are hard questions because it's like, is it a moral stance? Is it a principled stance? Is it the stance that you need to make so that others can similarly take that stance, and then it becomes impossible for the administration to actually plunge forward? It's a very hard calculation. So I'm not leveling critiques at my university. I really don't know what they're they're planning to do. Um, but playing into their hands, yeah, they want to starve the universities. They want to, and I've been saying to people, that our model, when folks look at what society that MAGA wants to emulate, it seems to always come back to Hungary. And like that is not a very ambitious project. No offense to my Hungarian American viewers on this call, but Hungary's in a bit of a no one's looking at Hungary as a model for anything other than insularity and kind of parochial crackdowns that are pretty corrupt. If you say, "Oh, I aspire to be this," or "I aspire," I want our country to look like Japan or Singapore or whatever it is, right? Like I want the cutting edge of whatever it is. But they want to be Hungary. Hungary jettisons it's the Central European University, which is like the crown achievement in many respects of the kind of post-Soviet movement to liberalize and make cosmopolitan Central and Eastern Europe. And they kicked it out of the country. And since then, there have been, campaigns against LGBT persons, against religious minorities, against immigrants, and also campaigning against like they don't want to be, they want to shrink NATO and reduce the kind of footprint. So if Chris Rufo and those types want to do that, I would take them at their word. Because I'd say like, oh, they're not going to really try to, starve the University of California system or really or bankrupt Harvard University. Yeah, they might want to do that. And the question is, well, what do we do in response? So the Central European University decamped for Vienna, I believe. I'm not sure what would happen, but I will tell you that if that happened, a lot of researchers will leave those schools and go to Canada or go to Europe or go to East Asia if they have the uh, uh, marketability to do so.
During this hour, I haven't heard you mention the other political party at all,
Yeah.
and the Democrats I'm referring to. And I'm wondering if you think that that's sort of um, that relying on the political parties to um, present an alternative and better political vision is a misbegotten idea, that we need to rely on something else ourselves. You keep saying we need to get ourselves out of this, or we need to operate on a state by state basis, but that the National Democratic Party is not equipped to handle this and to mount an effective resistance.
Yeah, so that's a really fair question. I do want to say when I was talking about the kind of blue states mobilizing and blue states combining, implicitly I was suggesting the Democratic leadership in those states that there was a political movement to support it. But your larger point holds about like, do the Democrats in Congress know how to get it? Do they have a plan? I don't think they do. Does the party have a coherent vision? I would hope so, but I'm not sure they do. And I think the challenge is um, uh, in I don't believe most people realized how swift and comprehensive and single-minded the administration would be about charging forward so quickly on so many fronts and being completely undeterred by judicial, wrist slaps and, universal condemnation, including the markets. So I don't want to give the Democrats a pass by any stretch, but I think they're overwhelmed in the moment, like everyone else is. And I do think the answer lies in states banding together to resist this. And implicitly, I guess I'm counting on Democratic leadership in those states to be doing that work. But it's not
And,
necessary that it's party based.
right. And in terms of the regular citizen, people watching here, um, what do you think that they need to do? And can you end this hour on a somewhat optimistic note?
Well, I think I would say, and I mean, I don't want to end it on the same note, but I do think we have resources at our disposal that we've not been willing to use as much, which is like we should be looking to our state governments to fill in a lot of what the federal government has been either has walked away from. And there's some opportunities there. If the federal government is not going to regulate the environment and not going to, regulate food and drugs, or and they're going to, basically walk away from a lot of spaces, cutting agencies, just, sending workers home, all that stuff. I think that's a real opportunity for states to come in, fill that gap, and fill it with a different and more powerful version of kind of a robust regulatory regime that then will be especially if it's someone like, again, like California, if the federal government, if Elon Musk says, like he did with the Department of Education, we're going to disband the EPA, well, California's got a really robust environmental infrastructure. Let's nationalize. Let's put it out there and force litigation on whether California has overstepped its bounds. And I'm not sure they will be seen as doing so. So I guess what I would do is I would really push blue states. This is a gut check moment. And I'm not campaigning for my university here, but it's my understanding that California, the state legislature has lowered its annual appropriations to the university system. If that's right, and again, I'm not sure it is, it strikes me as the absolutely the wrong thing to do, not because I'm an employee there, but because states need to be buttressing and filling in gaps, not saying, oh, well, tough times for everyone. We kind of got to counteract that. And that may be belt tightening. We hear that with like nonprofits have to kind of, spend down their endowments. I think we have to be in this moment that like if we don't spend now, if we don't devote the resources now, who knows what's going to be around in 5 or 10 years that maybe we shouldn't be worried about a fiscal crisis or 10 years from now if we're no longer the democracy that we've long kind of gradually worked our way into becoming.
The book is called Vigilante Nation. Here it is. Go check it out. Go buy it. By my guest. Thank you so much, Jon Michaels. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And join us next week when Stanford's Larry Diamond joins the former ambassador, Michael McFaul, in conversation, Trump's foreign policy, the impact on global democracy and U.S. national security. So a great foreign policy discussion. And be well, be good, be active, and I'll see you next time.